Thank you very much indeed for that wonderfully well-researched introduction. Must be said that introductions are not always so meticulously researched. But I would warn you that the size of one's Wikipedia entry is not an accurate measure of one's worth as a human being, and nor should everything in that Wikipedia entry be necessarily believed. It's a huge pleasure to be here. Hong Kong is one of my favorite cities in the world. I visited a few years ago a rival institution. I felt a spring in my step as I returned to Hong Kong this afternoon from my current temporary base to the north in Beijing. And it seems a good time to come to one of the great cities of East Asia and talk about the United States, its past, and its imminent future. Partly because I have a sense, after a couple of weeks in Beijing, that not everyone in China is entirely focused on what may be about to unfold in the United States, or if they're following events, they're not taking them entirely seriously. One of the strange phenomena of our time is the growth of the comic element in American politics. This was noticeable some years ago with the rise of The Daily Show. And a growing proportion of Americans began to follow the news through the humor of men like Jon Stewart and even more bizarrely Stephen Colbert. And there are many people, I think, who regard Donald Trump's election campaign as essentially a humorous exercise and not something to be taken seriously. I am here to tell you to take it very seriously. I'll show why in a moment. But I'm also here to try to relate contemporary events to history. That's really what I do for a living. I'd characterize myself as an applied historian. I try to apply history, and I'm going to spend the first part of my talk today talking about somebody else who did that, namely Henry Kissinger. Kissinger is one of those rare things in American public life. Somebody who enters the realm of power with a real historical understanding, with real knowledge. The United States is sometimes referred to as the United States of amnesia, because there is, by and large, relatively little interest in the past on the part of major decision makers. Kissinger is an exception to the rule of the history deficit. I want to begin by telling you what I've learned from writing the first half of his life. And then I'm going to take the lessons, the 6 lessons I've learned, and apply them to our contemporary predicament. I'll try not to go on excessive length in order to have time for discussion with you. It's really discussion that I enjoy much more than lecturing. So, now we need to get this thing to work. There. The younger people here will be perhaps amazed to learn that for a time, Henry Kissinger was one of the most famous people in the world. These are just a few of the magazine covers that he featured on at the height of his power in the 1970s. Notice in the top left-hand corner, Henry Kissinger as superhero. Super K was one of the many nicknames he acquired at that time. I say all this for 2 reasons. One, to make it clear to the students that we're dealing here with a singular phenomenon. I don't know about you, but I haven't seen John Kerry in the Superman outfit lately, and I would guess the number of magazine covers that he's made as Secretary of State is in the low single digits. It's hard to think of any Secretary of State, in fact, who's achieved this kind of celebrity in his time in office. But there's a second point, and the second point is that subsequently, Kissinger became almost as much reviled as he had been revered when in office. My countryman, Christopher Hitchens, wrote a book, first a series of articles and then a book, accusing Kissinger of war crimes, and there remains a substantial contingent in American academic life and also in other countries around the world that regards him as a kind of Dr. Evil figure. So to write the biography of a man who has been simultaneously, or rather sequentially, a superstar and then a hate figure is a challenge in its own right. The first half of Kissinger's life is not well known because most books about him focus on his time in the Nixon administration. But I've gone out of my way to tell his early life at great length because in many ways it's a story as classic and as inspiring as the story of Alexander Hamilton, the Treasury Secretary of the United States in the earliest years of the Republic, which has become the subject of the most successful musical in modern American history. And if you haven't yet heard at least a few tracks from the Hamilton soundtrack, you're missing out on one of the phenomena of modern popular culture. You could write a rap opera about the life of Henry Kissinger, because like Hamilton, he was an immigrant, and like Hamilton, his early life was one of hardship, because Henry Kissinger was born a Jew in Germany in the year 1923, so that before he even reached his 10th birthday, he was a Jew living under Hitler. This picture of Kissinger, the elder of the two boys in the picture with his brother and a cat, gives us a glimpse of his early life, but a misleading glimpse because you wouldn't know from this picture that these boys were already suffering significant discrimination because of their religion, nor would you know that in the same town of Fürth is next door to Nuremberg. Nuremberg was known as one of the centers of the National Socialist movement. In Fürth and in Nuremberg was a virulently anti-Semitic National Socialist movement. If you look closely here on the left-hand side, you'll see a sign. This is Fürth. There's a Nazi parade. Those children are doing the Hitler salute. And it says in the sign, Fürth city limits, Jews are our misfortune. So just imagine you're 10 years old, 11 years old, you're going through your early teens, and there are signs in your town saying, Jews are our misfortune. In the summer of 1938, the Kissingers left Germany wisely and emigrated via England to the United States of America. This was in the nick of time. Just a few months later was the Reichskristallnacht, the great pogrom against the Jews, that saw devastation and mayhem across Germany, not least in Fürth, where the synagogues were burnt down and a number of Jews were subjected to physical violence. In all, at least a dozen members of Kissinger's family, including his own grandmother, died in the subsequent Holocaust. Now imagine yourself returning to Germany. You left in 1938. 6 years later, you're back. in a US Army uniform. This picture of Kissinger was taken just after his infantry regiment arrived in Europe. He was, at this point, a simple rifleman. Incidentally, to be a rifleman in the US infantry in 1944 was one of the most dangerous jobs you could be assigned in World War II. And he was about to experience combat against the German army in the Battle of the Bulge, not long after this photograph was taken. It's worth knowing that Henry Kissinger saw action, was under artillery fire from Wehrmacht and SS units in order to understand his later relationship to military conflict. The army was able to identify that being able to speak fluent German was rather an advantage under the circumstances of 1944-45. And so, fortunately for Kissinger, he was pulled out of the ranks and put into counterintelligence. In the immediate post-war period, he was a Nazi hunter, hunting down and helping to convict the most egregious offenders in the Third Reich. Here he is with his mentor, Fritz Kramer, at the Counterintelligence Academy, where they both taught in South Germany after the war. Like some of you, Kissinger then went to an American college to study. He went to Harvard. In 1947, he applied to all the Ivy League colleges, and only Harvard accepted him. Because his application was late. And Yale and Princeton were like, sorry, you're late. Harvard bent the rules, to its credit. And in a few short years, this man went from writing his undergraduate senior thesis on the meaning of history to writing a doctoral dissertation on the Congress of Vienna to becoming a junior professor. And here you see the junior and rather chubby Professor Kissinger addressing some 1950s era Harvard undergrads. Kissinger was, and I want to emphasize this, a distinguished and successful academic in his own right. But he was also a public intellectual. That is to say, he didn't just write academic stuff. He also wrote more popular and more political books, appeared on television, spoke not only at Harvard but around the world, and became directly involved in policy. He was a consultant to the Kennedy administration. And then, in 1965, he went to Vietnam. And this picture was taken of Kissinger on his first visit to Vietnam. His job was essentially a fact-finding mission on behalf of the then US ambassador in Saigon in South Vietnam. And one of the most remarkable documents that I came across in my research was the diary that he kept of that trip. It's an amazing document because it reveals that after several weeks, not only in Saigon, but touring frontline areas, Kissinger concluded that the Vietnam War could not be won and would have to be ended by diplomatic means. Notice, 1965. Because of his reputation, because of his industry, and because of his already impressive connections, Kissinger became involved in the secret effort to achieve a breakthrough in talks with the North Vietnamese in 1967. And that's why you see him here with Lyndon Johnson, a president he's not normally associated with. Because Kissinger, on behalf of the Johnson administration, spent a long, fruitless summer in Paris trying to begin talks with the North Vietnamese. an entirely secret diplomatic effort, which was frustrated for the very simple reason that the North Vietnamese were planning the Tet Offensive and had absolutely no intention of beginning peace negotiations in good faith. At the end of 1968, in the aftermath of Richard Nixon's election victory, to everybody's amazement, he announced that Henry Kissinger would be his national security advisor. This was amazing because up until that point, Kissinger had consistently criticized Nixon and had been closely identified with Nixon's rival in the Republican Party, Nelson Rockefeller. And that's the story so far. You may be aware that subsequently, Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon were responsible for perhaps the boldest of all strategic moves in the Cold War, the so-called opening to China. In 1972, Richard Nixon went on a spectacular state visit to Beijing, a remarkable moment in so many ways, not the least of which was Nixon's reputation as a Cold War hawk. It was Kissinger who laid the foundation for that visit. It was Kissinger who made the secret trip to China in 1971. It was Kissinger who met with Zhou Enlai and paved the way for a fundamental shift in the global order, a shift greatly to the disadvantage of the Soviet Union. In my eyes, this was a turning point in history, not only strategically, but in other ways too. I have written about what I've called chimerica. Chimerica is a simple way of conveying a complex phenomenon, the symbiotic relationship that evolved in our time between the United States and the People's Republic of China. And I would argue that the origins of that fusion of China and America lie in the events of 1971-1972, and that in that sense, Kissinger deserves some credit as one of the fathers perhaps, of chimerica, of our age. Because I can think of few things that have more decisively shaped our age than the Chinese-American relationship. It has transformed the global economy, and it has transformed the international order. When you're writing somebody's biography, somebody who was a thinker as well as a doer, you do two things. You tell the story. I've just given you a potted version. But you also learn some lessons. And at the end of the book, as I was writing the conclusion, I sat down and asked myself, what have I learned from Henry Kissinger, the thinker? What did I learn from the writer, historian, political theorist that I didn't know before? There were 6 things. And these things are of universal applicability. So even if you are an engineer who congenitally doesn't give a damn about history, the next 6 slides will be relevant to your life. Okay? Do I have your attention now? The first is about history, admittedly. Allow me to break a lance on behalf of my own subject, but using the words of Henry Kissinger. Unlike most people in the early 1950s, whether they were working on systems analysis or macroeconomics or political science, Kissinger did history, and he chose as his dissertation subject an incredibly unpromising, unsexy, unfashionable topic, early 19th century European diplomacy. But what Kissinger took out of that seems to me to have a great and enduring significance. History, he wrote in his first book, A World Restored, teaches by analogy, not identity. No significant conclusions are possible in the study of foreign affairs without an awareness of the historical context, because history is the memory of states. Europeans living on a continent covered with ruins testifying to the fallibility of human foresight feel in their bones that history is more complicated than systems analysis. History is the memory of states. In another passage, Kissinger said that history is to states what character is to individuals. And this tells us that you cannot really do foreign policy if you do not have some historical understanding of your counterparty, of the other side. Because their self-understanding is shaped by their history. Foreign policy is not some multiplayer computer game in which each player is essentially interchangeable with the others. Foreign policy, and this is also true of foreign business, any negotiation across border is a negotiation between two different histories, at least. And the negotiator who doesn't understand the history of the other side is at a fundamental disadvantage. Lesson 2. Most choices are between evils. This is certainly true in the realm of foreign policy, but I think it may be more generally true, in fact. Writing in Nuclear Weapons and Foreign Policy, the first bestseller that Kissinger wrote, the one that made him a celebrity, he said, referring to the Cold War, "We are certain to be confronted with situations of extraordinary ambiguity, such as civil wars or domestic coups. There can be no doubt that we should seek to forestall such occurrences. But once they have occurred, we must find the will to act in a situation which permits only a choice among evils. This presupposes above all a moral act, a willingness to run risks on partial knowledge and for a less than perfect application of one's principles. The insistence on absolutes is a prescription for inaction." Most choices in foreign policy are between evils. Rarely is one confronted with an option that is entirely compatible with motherhood, apple pie, and other nice things. And this is a central problem which many students of the Cold War, and indeed of other periods, have struggled to understand. Academics rarely face life and death decisions. The toughest decision the average professor takes is a tenure promotion case. Kissinger famously said that academic life was so poisonous because the stakes are so low. When the stakes are high, there are few good options. The statesman has to choose between evils, and the moral imperative is to choose the lesser evil. It is extremely easy to write a book about any country with which the United States had relations in the 1970s and to say that wicked things were done in that country and that the United States tolerated them, perhaps even supported them. I could show you a shelf of books that do that about one country after another. Cambodia, Bangladesh, and so on. Chile. Almost none of these books ask the question, what was the alternative that would have been morally preferable? And how can we relate the events in this country to the broader strategy of the Cold War, which after all was paramount in the minds of decision makers? Now my favorite. the problem of conjecture. I promise you, once you have listened to me talk about the problem of conjecture, you will never look with such interest at your cell phone again. Just checking. Because the problem of conjecture is a deeply interesting and universal problem that I hadn't really fully understood until I read this. And it was in an unpublished essay. Perhaps the deepest problem, Kissinger wrote, is the problem of conjecture in foreign policy. Each political leader has the choice between making the assessment which requires the least effort or making an assessment which requires more effort. If he makes the assessment that requires least effort, then as time goes on, it may turn out that he was wrong, and then he will have to pay a heavy price. If he acts on the basis of a guess, he will never be able to prove that his effort was necessary. But he may save himself a great deal of grief later on. If he acts early, he cannot know whether it was necessary. If he waits, he may be lucky, or he may be unlucky. It is a terrible dilemma. The specific case that Kissinger had in mind was a case that had affected his life profoundly. The decision of the British and French governments in the 1930s to appease Nazi Germany. Appeasement was a classic line of least resistance option. The difficult thing would have been to do what Winston Churchill urged and to go to war in 1938, when Nazi Germany was still relatively weak, on the Czech or Czechoslovak question. But of course, the problem of conjecture has a general relevance. At any moment, a decision maker may fear disaster. He may foresee some great calamity. And then he has to decide whether to act preemptively to stop it. The problem is, he can't be sure. Whatever happens, if he acts, he incurs the cost of action. If he successfully avoids disaster, nobody is grateful. Because nobody's grateful for disasters that are averted. They don't happen. Nobody knows. Suppose Britain had gone to war in 1938 and there'd been a successful coup against Hitler. There would have been a small war over Czechoslovakia and no World War II. Would anyone say that Churchill had averted World War II? No, because there would have been no World War II. This is the problem of conjecture. In a democracy, it is exceedingly tempting to play for time. We use the expression all the time, kick the can down the road. This is what Europeans have been doing since the crisis. It's easier to do that because you don't incur the costs of doing something. And you may get lucky. Maybe disaster won't strike. And if it does strike, then you could just say, that was an unforeseeable calamity. Nowadays, we'd probably call it a black swan. And nobody will blame you. The problem of conjecture. It exists not only in foreign policy, it exists in monetary policy. Every central banker faces the problem of conjecture. Have we done too much? Should we do more QE? Should we try negative rates? Should we just play for time and hope that something turns up? One point that Kissinger makes in this connection is that decision makers who wait for more data are paralyzed. There will never be data to help you resolve the problem of conjecture because it's in the future. And when decision makers tell you, oh, it's data dependent, be very afraid. It will surprise you to learn that in all his writings about foreign policy, Kissinger was critical of people who were or thought of themselves as realists. This is surprising because he's usually thought of as the arch-realist. My book shows that this is wrong. That's why I've subtitled it The Idealist. Kissinger wrote about Bismarck. He wrote about Metternich, he ended up working for Richard Nixon. But none of these things made him a realist. On the contrary, Kissinger was an idealist in at least three respects. He was an idealist because he saw appeasement as a failure of realism. He was an idealist because he immersed himself in the study of the philosophy of Kant at Harvard, the great German idealist philosopher. And he was an idealist because whereas most people thought the Cold War would be determined by economics, most people were materialists, both the Soviets and all those American economists. Kissinger believed the Cold War was about ideals. In his unpublished book on Bismarck, which I found in his private papers, imagine the excitement of that moment. By God, he wrote a book on Bismarck, and here it is. And he never published it. And now I get to read it. That's why being a historian is actually fun. In the unpublished biography, he writes a very extraordinary thing about realism, specifically with Bismarck in mind. Societies are incapable of the courage of cynicism. The insistence on men as atoms, on societies as forces, has always led to a tour de force eroding all self-restraint. Because societies operate by approximations, and because they're incapable of fine distinctions, a doctrine of power as a means may end up by making power an end. So Kissinger was the critic, not the admirer of Bismarck. And all those books that have suggested he was the American Bismarck or the American Metternich have been written by people who didn't bother to read anything that he wrote on those subjects. Finally, penultimately, two to go. The balance of power is really difficult. It doesn't just happen. It's not naturally occurring. In a very interesting letter from 1951, Kissinger writes, a balance of power depends on A, a geographically determined area, B, an equilibrium of strength within that area, C, an outside balancer with a profound conception of national strategy and unencumbered by ideological considerations, D, a large measure of agreement on basic values within that concert of powers. The balancer must not himself be part of the equilibrium except to tip the scale. Above all, policy must be conceived as a continuing process, with war as merely an instrument for the achievement of determinate objectives. That is complicated because the balance of power is complicated. A central insight of Kissinger's early work is just how delicate a thing it is. The balance doesn't just happen. You have to have a balancer, and the balancer is kind of half in and half out. Moreover, the balance requires legitimacy. People need to believe in it for it to be stable. A key point that Kissinger makes repeatedly is that if there's a revolutionary power on the scene, it will be almost impossible to achieve the balance of power, because the revolutionary power will challenge the very legitimacy of the balance itself. One last and crucial point. Because of the way the American political system works, the wrong person usually has the top job. Kissinger, of course, could never be president. He was born, as I said, in Germany, not in the United States. He therefore was condemned to work with Americans. In a very brilliant essay that he wrote just before he entered government, he characterized the central problem of American political life. The typical political leader of the contemporary society is a man with a strong will, a high capacity to get himself elected, but no very great conception of what he is going to do when he gets into office. As a result, he argued, there is no such thing as an American foreign policy. There's only a series of moves that have produced a certain result that they may not have been planned to produce, and to which research and intelligence organizations, either foreign or national, attempt to give a rationality and consistency which it simply does not have. This was born of experience. Kissinger, by this time, had seen the policy-making process in Washington, D.C., and he had realized that foreign policy in the United States is the accidental byproduct of interagency rivalry, departmental feuds, presidential indecision or indifference, a variety of factors that most analysts of American foreign policy, especially those abroad, seemed to miss. So these are my 6 lessons. And these are the things I learned from writing this book that I really didn't know before. And now I want to apply them. For those of you who are very focused on the present, the next 6 slides are for you. And you'll be happy to hear that there's almost no text. It's nearly all pictures. And yes, we do get to Donald Trump. But first, the point about history being the memory of states, the character of states. Imagine trying to understand Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping without having any real knowledge of Russian history or Chinese history. What chance would you have of understanding what economists call their utility function? Both men, it seems to me, are unintelligible without some historical knowledge. How could you understand Putin if you didn't understand what it was to live through the collapse of the Soviet Union as a KGB officer? And how could you understand President Xi if you had no knowledge of the Cultural Revolution, the seminal event in the lives of that generation of Chinese? So it seems to me that Kissinger's first point applies extremely well in our own time. And not only in these 2 cases, wherever you look. Wherever you look. How could you possibly explain the debate about British membership or non-membership of the European Union if you knew no history? You wouldn't get what the Brexiteers are trying to tap into, that deep-rooted English sense that there's something funny about those people on the other side of the channel. I did some research into the famous headline that some of you may know, Fog in the Channel, Continent Cut Off. Think about it. This turns out to be apocryphal. There never was such a headline in the London Times, which is kind of reassuring. It was always a joke that the English made at their own expense. Most choices are between evils. Angela Merkel, last year, as some of you may have noticed, had a kind of epiphany on TV. It was when a little Palestinian girl started to cry as Chancellor Merkel explained why her family would need to be deported as illegal immigrants whose asylum requests had been denied. And as this little girl cried, Angela Merkel spontaneously stepped off the podium, went down to comfort her, and explained, we just can't do this. Wir können es nicht schaffen. Meaning we can't accept enormous numbers of immigrants like your family. Just weeks later, Merkel, realizing that this was an unsustainable position, went on television and said, wir können es schaffen, we can do it. German policy turned 180 degrees, the gates of Europe were wide open, and in the space of 6 months, roughly 1 million people entered Europe, mostly through Greece, and headed for Germany. What was the right choice? Was it a good option? There is no easy, good option when you're confronted with potentially millions of people fleeing broken, failed states like Syria to Northern Europe. Angela Merkel confronted one of those agonizing dilemmas. She had a choice between evils. This is my favorite ever New Yorker cartoon. And I think of it almost every day, because almost every day somebody is trying to persuade me to do something, and I feel like saying, no, Thursday's out. How about never? Is never good for you? This is essentially how many politicians feel about difficult decisions. Say, structural reform in mainland China. All over China, there are officials saying, how about never? Would never be good for structural reform? In the US Congress, there are people who say, when it comes to reducing the deficit, how about never? Would never work for you? And so on. So the problem of conjecture is inescapable. And to be more serious, President Obama was confronted by it when the Syrian revolution became a civil war. He was urged by his most senior cabinet members to intervene in the Syrian civil war in 2012 to prevent Syria descending into a maelstrom of violence. And he, almost alone, decided not to. In 2013, the red line that he'd drawn on the use of chemical weapons became a pink dotted line. Only in 2014, after American hostages had been decapitated by Islamic State, did he intervene, but he did so with minimum force. The problem of conjecture is right there. Obama played for time. Because the thought of intervention, especially given what had happened in Iraq, not to mention Libya, seemed too expensive politically. And now the result is that Syria is a bigger mess than Iraq. Non-intervention, inaction, has turned out to be more costly in terms of human life than action. Only one man ever really got the better of Henry Kissinger in Washington politics, and it was this man, Don Rumsfeld. I think by the time of the second Bush administration, by 2001-2, Donald Rumsfeld had achieved a cynicism unrivaled in American history. A cynicism that could take 9/11 and use it as the pretext for an invasion of Iraq and a regime change in Baghdad that really had nothing whatever to do with 9/11. A cynicism that saw it as an opportunity primarily to assert the power of the Secretary of Defense over the rest of the Pentagon and of the Pentagon over the rest of the US government. But the case of Donald Rumsfeld, a man whose intellect I greatly admire, illustrates Kissinger's point that a complete cynicism, a completely cynical realism, ultimately is politically corrosive. Iraq ended in catastrophe. The design was fundamentally a realist design, unanchored to any meaningful ideal, although the neoconservatives rationalized it. In Rumsfeld's mind, there was no grand design to democratize the Middle East. That was Wolfowitz. Rumsfeld's design was a purely realist design, and it was a disaster. Periodically, President Obama talks about the balance of power. He did it in an interview with Jeffrey Goldberg in the Atlantic Monthly last year. This was before his longer interview with Goldberg this year. And I'm very struck by the fact that in President Obama's mind, the balance of power kind of just happens. He talked about how there needed to be a balance between the Sunni and the Shia in the Middle East and a balance between Israelis and Palestinians in Israel. But his whole presidency has illustrated how very difficult the balance of power is. By tilting somewhat towards Iran with the nuclear deal and the lifting of sanctions last year, President Obama has unintentionally created an arms race in the region as the Sunni powers seek to prevent Iranian domination of a post-American Middle East. Do not believe anyone who tells you this problem is simple. As this map shows you, the web of interests that you would have to somehow square to stabilize just Syria and Iraq is enormously intricate. The balance of power is complicated. Until the United States figures that out, the Middle East is going to be more violent. And I can predict with near certainty there will be more violence in the Middle East next year than there was this year, and there was more this year than there was last year, and there was more last year than the year before. This escalation of conflict is not sufficiently appreciated, certainly not, in my experience, in East Asia, despite the fact that the Chinese economy is now much more reliant on oil from the Middle East than the US economy. Notice, China is not in this diagram. Should it be? At what point will China need to take an interest in the chronic imbalance of power in the Middle East? Presumably at the point when the dollar price of oil climbs back towards $100 simply because of supply disruption. Watch Saudi Arabia. Watch carefully. The next black swan will likely be flying over Riyadh. And finally, if you believe in prediction markets, if you believe in the odds that are generated by betting, and Hong Kong is a city that is fond of a flutter, then you don't really worry too much about Donald Trump. Because according to Betfair's latest odds, he has a 1 in 4 chance of being the next president of the United States. I am certain that that is wrong. I am sure that that is too low. In my view, the probability that Donald Trump will be the next president of the United States is closer to 1 in 2. And I base that on real-time polling data. Tuesday, this week. 3 key swing states, Florida, Ohio, Pennsylvania. Clinton 43, Trump 42. Clinton 39, Trump 43, Clinton 43, Trump 42. Go figure. At one level, it kind of doesn't matter who is the nominee on either side. American elections are close. It's been a long time since we saw a really big swing, a landslide, a decisive victory at the popular vote level. And I think it's even more likely to be close when an outsider candidate with an obviously spectacular demagogic talent, who's already ridden a wave of near revolution against his own party's establishment, takes on the ultimate establishment candidate, Hillary Clinton. If Donald Trump is elected president, all of our lives are going to be more uncertain. When Arianna Huffington said last year she would confine coverage of the Trump campaign to the entertainment section of the Huffington Post, everybody laughed. But we shouldn't laugh anymore. The political class underestimated Donald Trump disastrously. At Davos in January, I was assured, he would be gone by Super Tuesday. He stood no chance when real primaries with real votes began. People have underestimated him every month since this began. And I advise you strongly, if your projection is consistently wrong, month after month after month, it's the model that's the problem. So my model now says, ignore these odds. They were wrong, they've been wrong, they're wrong. Just as Nate Silver is wrong. He was wrong all the way through. Everybody who's paid to write about American politics was wrong. Everybody who'd made their life working in the Republican Party was wrong. So think about what that implies, and this is my concluding reflection. What it implies is that there's a 50-50 chance that Americans this November could elect a man who is committed to building a wall along the Mexican border, to banning, or at least he's dialed it down, limiting Muslim immigration to the United States, and who has repeatedly threatened a trade war against China, an across-the-board tariff on Chinese goods because, quote, we're being raped by China in trade, unquote. It is a dangerous mistake to assume that Donald Trump is just saying this stuff to get elected. Why? One, when he said it first, everybody said, oh, that will guarantee he doesn't get elected. Now he's jumped the shark. It's done. It's over. And every time his popularity grew. Two, if you are a populist leader who gets elected in a revolt against established party structures, your supporters are already proven to be fickle. They just defected from Jeb Bush, from Marco Rubio, from the establishment characters. And they will defect from Donald Trump if he does not deliver. Do not think that this is just BS. American populists have done amazing things before. In 1873, after a financial crisis, Californian populists began to agitate against Chinese immigration to California. There was a man named Dennis Kearney. Nobody's ever heard of him now. But for a brief period, Kearney was the Donald Trump of Californian politics. In 1882, the US Congress passed an Exclusion Act effectively banning Chinese immigration to the United States. Something like a dozen subsequent legal measures between then and the 1920s ended entirely Chinese migration to the United States. Stuff like this happens in American history. Populism is a powerful force in a post-financial crisis world. And all of us, particularly those of us who live in China, should not make the mistake of underestimating this threat. That, ladies and gentlemen, is my final lesson from history. Thank you very much.